Welcome to the first BeastPC Christmas special. It's an American northeastern winter, there's snow on the ground, Christmas decorations are up, and the temperatures are around freezing. Which means it's time to do some extreme overclocking. Open the windows or go outside and use that frosty winter air for some extreme cooling. In preparations for this, let's break out a huge 420mm liquid cooler, 750 watt power supply, high-end thermal paste, and get overclocking. But what to overclock on? A couple weeks ago, while scrolling through an online marketplace, we came across this combo, an Asus Maximus 9 Hero and a Core i7 7700K, delidded with liquid metal. Sounds like the perfect combo. A high-end board and some nice and cool overclocking focused 14nm plus silicon. Setting up our test system here, the ambient temperature is less than 10 degrees Celsius, so everything should be 15 degrees cooler than if we ran at 25 degrees standard room temperature, meaning extra overclocking headroom. The AIO is an Arctic Liquid Freezer 420, huge and powerful, and we'll use some Thermal Grizzly cryonaut between the CPU IHS and the cooler, keeping in mind that there's liquid metal under that IHS, so the temperatures should be really good. Now we went into Windows 10 and did a preliminary overclock. According to Silicon Lottery data, almost all 7700Ks can do 4.9 GHz with AVX offset of -2 at 1.412 volts, so since we were feeling extra lucky, we went straight for 5.0 GHz without AVX offset. And in Prime 95 and AVX program, it seemed stable for about 10 minutes. So we turned the frequency up to 5.1 and left the voltage the same at 1.412 volts, and it still worked. We tried again at 5.2 and still didn't touch the voltage. And to our surprise, it kept on working. Well, at 5.3 GHz, our luck started to run out. It wasn't quite stable in Prime 95 anymore, but after increasing the voltage to 1.45 volts, it ended up fine. We still had plenty of headroom to keep overclocking since the voltage wasn't at any unsafe levels just yet, and the chip was staying plenty cool. So we gave it 1.5 volts, which is starting to get a little unsafe for daily use, but fine for quick testing, and 5.4 GHz booted. We tried again at 5.5 GHz, and after some tweaking here and there to get it to pass Cinebench at 1.53 volts, it gave a score of 1,234 points. Now let's take a step back and look at where we are already. I remember how special I felt to overclock my first PC to 5.0 GHz, only to find it to blue screen a couple of seconds later. We just outdid that by an entire 10%, benchmark stable at 5.5, using nothing more than a CPU delidded with liquid metal, an off-the-shelf AIO, and Mother Nature's low temperatures. In terms of the Cinebench score, the 7700K has 4 cores and 8 threads. The very popular Ryzen 5 1600, which was from the same era, has 6 cores and 12 threads, basically 50% more. It scores from 1,100 to 1,200 points, meaning we trounced a 6-core CPU at stock by overclocking the heck out of a quad-core. In fact, we even beat a stock 1600X by just a tiny margin. That's what high frequency will do to you. But why stop there? After breaking the 5 GHz barrier so many times, the line is redrawn at 6 GHz, and we're on track to break it. Even though it doesn't quite seem like it right now, we will reach the dream. It'll just take some creative engineering to get it done. Before we started, we did some research about voltages on Intel Skylake CPUs and their descendants. We came across forum posts of people passing benchmarks for a couple minutes at 1.5 volts, 1.55, even 1.6 volts without damaging their chips at all, but don't quote us on that, and only for a few minutes. We then found a guy who purposefully killed some chips, who said that idling at 1.7 volts would degrade the CPU by a couple percent in just a few hours, and at 1.75 volts, his CPUs randomly just started dying. So we made it a rule of thumb, absolutely no more than 1.6 volts for quick benchmarks and 1.65 volts just idling, banking on the lower temperatures to make sure our chip wouldn't blow up. It's a brave little chip this, heading into a suicide mission. Well, let's keep overclocking higher. 5.6 GHz at the same voltage was a breeze, so we turned it right up to 5.7. Now, it's getting to be a little more of a struggle, so we gave in about 1.56 volts, and we disabled hyperthreading for that added stability boost, so our CPU effectively has only 4 threads now. We decided to give up Cinebench multi-core as passing the whole benchmark would be pretty hopeless and went in favor of single core. After a couple of tries and some voltage tweaking here and there, we finally managed to get a score, 250 points. For reference, a stock modern 10900K will do about 235 points, and other Intel Skylake descendants at 5 GHz will do about 220. So we're quite a ways higher. AMD claims that their 5000 series are by far the fastest CPUs in single-core workloads, their scores untouchable by Intel. Well, we're getting quite close, since the 5600X does 260 points, 10 points higher, and the 5900X and above seem to do 270. Very impressive for Zen 3, and very impressive for a Skylake-based 7700K. By now, we had a lot of hope of hitting 6 GHz, although our voltages were getting a little bit high. We decided to not stress the CPU at all anymore, and we gave up benchmarking. We then tried 5.8 GHz, and surprisingly, we were able to enter Windows and get a CPU-Z screenshot. Keep in mind that all of the cores are still enabled, and this is Windows 10. We really are on the very edge of stability, even just idling there on the desktop. So for these last 0.2 GHz, we'd have to take creative measures. To further help us hit high frequencies, we decided to install Windows XP, which has way less bloatware and should be a little bit more stable. Installing XP was not exactly easy. We faced problems with the ACPI and CPU being stuck at base clock 4.2 GHz, but we eventually figured the issue out. We also didn't install GPU drivers, which now in hindsight was probably not the smartest idea, since even dragging some windows around would put a load on the CPU. Now, we had one more trick up our sleeve, which was to completely disable 3 cores, leaving just 1 core and 1 thread on, which hopefully would be the best core. We tried and tried to get it to 5.9 GHz and pass a CPU-Z validation, and we eventually got there at 1.58 volts, with just 1 core and 1 thread running, AIO blasting at full power, and ambient temperatures of 0 degrees Celsius. We're in the home stretch now, just 0.1 more GHz, and we can do 6.0. But by now we were running into a problem. Just booting into Windows XP was stressful enough to cause instability. So we pulled out a master trick. We would load into the operating system at a low frequency that would be quite stable, then use Intel's XTU software to simply turn up the frequency to 6.0 GHz and pull a CPU validation inside the operating system. This way, we'd avoid stressing the CPU at all and nurse it along to 6.0 GHz just by idling. But XTU doesn't work in Windows XP, so after considering our options, we decided to create a Windows 7 boot disk, because anything would be better than Windows 10. After doing that and then disabling basically all of the Windows features that would take any CPU power, we installed XTU. We put in 1.6 volts at just 5.2 GHz, then turned uncore frequency and RAM frequency down as low as they would go. We then loaded into the operating system, then opened up CPU-Z and XTU alongside, dragged the multiplier slider to 60 times, hitting apply. Oh, XTU crashed. But the system is still up and running, so quick, get a CPU-Z validation. It wasn't quite enough to validate. That's okay. We gave 1.62 volts as a final attempt. Trying again, opening CPU-Z and XTU, dragging the slider to 60x, hitting apply. XTU crashed again, but the CPU and the system are still running, limping, just barely holding on. We hit validate and it validated. We've successfully broken the 6 GHz barrier. Now, let's zoom out again at the bigger picture. This is still just a delated 7700K, with an off-the-shelf liquid cooler, unmodified motherboard, and a 0-degree ambient temperature thanks to Mother Nature. Anybody in temperate climates should be able to attempt this kind of overclock without having to resort to extreme cooling like dry ice or liquid nitrogen. If you couldn't tell, we're extremely proud of our overclock, even though admittedly 6 GHz is pretty useless, especially because it's on one core and one thread, and you can't even load Windows on it, much less run any benchmarks. It's just cool to see. By the way, we're not done overclocking yet. As a last-ditch effort for just a couple more megahertz, we turned the base clock from 100 MHz to 100.5. Trying the same tactic again gave us a CPU-Z validation of 6027.84 MHz, putting us solidly in the 6 GHz realm. This placed us top 59 in the world for 7700Ks, the highest with water cooling, and the highest without exotic cooling solutions. And we're top 1250 for all CPU frequencies. What an overclock, what a CPU, and what a cooler. This is a truly golden 7700K, and this has been a truly wild adventure. We hope you had fun watching, because it was certainly a lot of fun to do this overclock. That's all for this video. If you liked this video, please leave a like and please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Have a Merry Christmas, everybody.